Okay, let's unpack this. We often look at the ordinary cow in a pasture, that classic image of quiet domesticity, and we really never consider the sheer depth of history it represents. Now, try to adjust your internal scale. What if that familiar animal was descended from a colossal, aggressive, wild beast, an ancestor standing nearly 6 feet tall at the shoulder, boasting horns so immense they measured nearly 3 feet long, and coiled like something from a mythological saga?
That animal is the aurochs, Bos primigenius. It is the extinct species of wild bovine that is the universal ancestor of virtually all modern domestic cattle on the planet today. And that covers everything from, the European dairy broods to the heat-tolerant zebu of India and Africa.
And today we're doing a deep dive into this creature's life, its inevitable death, and the incredible enduring genetic legacy it maintains centuries after its extinction. This isn't just about a prehistoric animal. It's about tracing the continuous thread of human civilization back to the moment we first chose to tame the wild.
And our sources for this deep dive are truly illuminating. Our mission is to trace the aurochs from its evolutionary origins, analyzing its vast global reach across 3 continents, and detailing its profound interaction, both violent and reverent, with ancient humans. We will then delve into the surprisingly complex story of its domestication, which happened not once but twice across 2 major continental landmasses, and finally track its heartbreaking disappearance.
And what truly anchors this story in the human timeline, making it so historically potent, is that simple, precise fact that the final known aurochs didn't vanish in some remote Ice Age wilderness. No, died relatively recently in a specifically managed royal forest in Poland in the year 1627. This historical overlap, this proximity to the Age of Enlightenment, tells us that the pressure we exerted on the wild world is not just a modern problem, but a centuries-old process. So, to understand the legacy, we have to start with the animal itself. Taxonomically, we are focused on Bos primigenius. Can we clarify the naming and categorization right out of the gate, especially given that it's the ancestor of all domestic cattle?
Certainly. The species was formally described by the German anatomist Ludwig Heinrich Bejanus in 1825, with the formal publication following in 1827. And the name Bos primigenius is critical.
What does it actually mean?
Well, the etymology is a direct link to its reputation. Both ar and or are ancient Germanic or Celtic root words, meaning wild ox. So the name essentially translates to the first or original wild ox.
Right. And speaking of nomenclature, I recall from the sources that there was some confusion historically about how to distinguish the wild species from the domestic one, Bos taurus.
That's right. And that's because the 2 interbred expensively, particularly during the early stages of European domestication, so there was ambiguity. However, the International Commission on Zoological Nomenclature, the ICD-10, they made a crucial ruling in 2003.
What did they decide?
They formally placed Bos primigenius on the official list of specific names, definitively establishing it as the valid name for the wild ancestor. And this distinction is vital for researchers because it allows us to clearly separate the wild genetic profile from the domestic, which helps us trace back the origins of various cattle traits.
So it was an officially recognized distinctive species. And the core distinction, physically speaking, was just sheer, unapologetic size. This was absolutely a member of the Pleistocene megafauna.
Oh, absolutely. They were truly colossal, particularly the bulls of the northern European subspecies. A fully grown aurochs bull could reach a shoulder height of up to 1.8 meters, which is roughly 5 feet 11 inches.
Wow. To put that in perspective, the largest modern domesticated bull breeds, like a Charolais or something, they rarely get over 1.6 meters.
Exactly. The aurochs would have literally towered over them. And even the cows were large, reaching 1.55 meters, so about 5'1".
And the weight is just staggering.
Indeed. We're talking about powerful, dense animals. Estimates for some of the late Middle Pleistocene individuals, the older, larger specimens, suggested they could weigh up to 1,500 kilograms.
Which is over 3,300 pounds.
Mm-hmm. Contrast that with an average Holstein dairy cow, which typically weighs around, 700 to 800 kilograms. The aurochs was double the weight. It was a physical force that defined its ecosystem.
Was it simply a bulked-up version of a modern bull, or did its body shape really reflect its wild, aggressive nature? I'm thinking of a modern bison, with that very distinct, sloping, powerful profile.
The sources confirm the aurochs shared that same athletic distinction. It was not built for maximum beef yield.
Right, it was built for survival.
For survival and combat. A key feature was its long, slender legs, which meant its shoulder height nearly equaled its trunk length, giving it this exceptionally tall stance. And crucially, the bulls had profoundly expressed neck and shoulder musculature, making the forehand significantly larger and more robust than the rear.
So it had that powerful sloping profile, which is very different from the square, heavy, and often rear-dominant profile of most modern domestic breeds.
Exactly, because those have been bred for meat distribution. Even small details point to its wildness. The udder on the Aurochs cows was small and barely visible, designed only for the needs of the calf, not for human dairy harvesting.
That really emphasizes its role as a fighting, surviving animal. But the feature that made it an icon in Paleolithic art and later mythology has to be those massive horns. They must have been terrifying weapons.
They were the ultimate expression of its power. These weren't subtle antlers. They were immense keratinous sheaths, reaching up to 80 centimeters, or 31 inches in length. And the base diameter could hit 10 to 20 centimeters. The sources really emphasize the unique curvature. The horns emerged from the skull at a sharp, forward-facing 60-degree angle to the muzzle, and then they curved in this complex three-dimensional fashion upwards and outwards, then forwards and inwards, and finally inwards and upwards at the tips. This specific curvature is immediately recognizable in ancient depictions, and it gave the animal incredible leverage and striking power.
I remember seeing mention of some truly enormous horn cores in the sources.
Yes, the skeletal evidence is compelling. For example, the basal circumference of some horn cores reached 44.5 centimeters in the largest Chinese specimens, and an astonishing 48 centimeters in a French find. The sheer size meant these horns were not merely defensive, they were the defining characteristic of the male's prowess.
So we have sexual dimorphism in size, but did the sexes also look different in terms of coat color?
Absolutely, and this dimorphism is one of the most persistent genetic traits. The bulls were pitch black, often described as a pure, glossy black, and they were distinguished by a contrasting light eel stripe, a gray or pale streak running down the middle of the back.
And the cows.
The cows, however, retained a lighter reddish-brown color, which likely offered better camouflage in woodland environments. Both sexes shared a light-colored muzzle.
And that specific coloration is fascinating because it's precisely what we find recurring in so many primitive domestic breeds in southern Europe today.
It is. It's a direct, visible genetic echo of the wild ancestor.
That's the link that really makes this concrete. That tiny gray stripe, or the difference between the black bull and the red cow, is a living reminder of the 1,500-kilogram ancestor.
And if we follow that genetic link back into deep time, we see the evolutionary roots of the Bovini tribe, which includes all cattle and buffalo evolving around 11.7 million years ago. But the specific lineage of Bos, the genus of the Aurochs, diverged much, much later.
Right, so where exactly did this lineage take shape, and how far back are we talking?
The Bos lineage split off roughly 2.5 to 1.65 million years ago. Now, there is still a debate regarding the species' ultimate geographic origin. You've got viable hypotheses suggesting either an African or an Asian start.
But is there a leading theory?
Well, the oldest securely dated fossil for the Aurochs species itself, Bos primigenius, dates to about 0.78 million years ago, and that was discovered in Tunisia's Kef Governorate. So this discovery tends to favor the hypothesis that the species evolved in Africa and then subsequently spread northward, migrating into Eurasia during the Middle Pleistocene epoch, a time of significant faunal exchange between the continents.
An ancient African origin then, followed by this massive global expansion. That kind of distribution, stretching from the Indian Ocean to the Atlantic, it inevitably leads to geographic isolation and the formation of distinct subspecies.
It does. And we recognize three primary historical subspecies, which reflect its immense historical distribution across continents. First, you had the Eurasian Aurochs, BP primigenius, which had the largest range and was the last to survive, existing in Eastern Europe until the 17th century.
Okay, that's one.
Second, the Indian Aurochs, BP pneumaticus, which populated the Indian subcontinent and became the exclusive ancestor of zebu cattle. And third, the North African Aurochs, BP mauritanicus, which lived north of the Sahara Desert.
That's a significant trifecta. But I noticed the sources also mention some emerging genetic evidence. It suggests we may need to reconsider East Asia as a fourth distinct group.
That's correct. And it highlights the ongoing nature of genetic discovery. Mitochondrial DNA analysis conducted by Chinese geneticists points strongly to an East Asian aurochs population, sometimes tentatively named BP sinensis, which was concentrated in northern China.
And what did that research show?
It showed that these populations were genetically isolated for extremely long periods during the Pleistocene. This suggests they developed independently enough from the Eurasian groups to warrant separate subspecies consideration, even if their external morphology often remained very similar to their European relatives.
It truly was a pan-global species then, stretching from the Gulf of Finland in the west all the way to Siberia, down through North Africa, and across to the Indian subcontinent. How did such a large animal maintain such a massive range through the dramatic climate changes of the Pleistocene?
The answer lies in adaptability and strategic retreat. The aurochs distribution was profoundly tied to the ebb and flow of ice ages. During warm interglacial periods, they thrived and spread widely across Europe. However, when the brutal glacial periods hit, they were forced to retreat south.
Into warmer pockets.
Exactly. Genomic analysis has consistently confirmed that they utilized warmer southern refugia, specifically the Iberian, Italian, and Balkan peninsulas, as biological shelters to survive the worst of the cold. This pattern of dispersal and retreat is key to understanding how they maintain genetic diversity across such a huge area.
And what specific environment did this grazer prefer? Was it built for the open steppes like a bison, or did it prefer denser cover?
The evidence suggests an impressive ecological flexibility. While they're often associated with the megafauna of the open plains, analysis shows they predominantly utilized riparian forests, so wetlands and woods along rivers and the edges of lakes.
That makes sense for post-glacial Europe, which was densely forested.
It does, but they also certainly inhabited open grasslands, using them for grazing when available.
I find the dietary analysis particularly insightful here, because it shows the extent of that flexibility wasn't just geographical, but behavioral.
It does. Studies of tooth wear, particularly on specimens from Denmark, demonstrated that their diet shifted over time. In the immediate post-glacial period, the pre-boreal, they were primarily abrasion-dominated grazers, focusing heavily on tough grasses.
But that changed.
Yes. Later in the Holocene, they transitioned into being mixed feeders. They were consuming a variety of grasses, but also acorns, bark, and twigs. This capability to adapt their diet based on available resources, a true mixed feeder strategy, was a major reason for their widespread success and longevity. Until, of course, human pressure began to restrict them severely to marginal forest boundaries and open country.
The aurochs wasn't just a part of the ecosystem. It was a defining figure in human culture, and this interaction began long before we ever thought about milking them. We are talking about interaction with archaic hominins hundreds of thousands of years ago.
That's where the narrative truly starts. The interaction began with Neanderthals. At the Biache-Saint-Vaast site in northern France, we have compelling evidence of butchery aurochs bones showing clear-cut marks and burn signs dating back 240,000 years. This shows they were a crucial food source, and it would have required sophisticated cooperative hunting techniques to bring one down.
But the relationship wasn't purely utilitarian, was it? There's evidence suggesting they were symbols of conquest, even for Neanderthals.
Exactly. The Cueva de Cubierta site in Spain is particularly provocative. Researchers there found evidence suggesting that Neanderthals kept the skulls of aurochs, possibly alongside red deer and bison, displayed in a way that implies they were potent hunting trophies, maybe even totemic objects.
A challenge, a conquest.
A physical embodiment of power.
And once our ancestors reached the Upper Paleolithic, the aurochs was immortalized in art, becoming a canvas for human awe. It's one of the most widely depicted animals in the great European caves.
The awe this massive creature inspired is unmistakable, preserved in charcoal and pigment. We see these magnificent dynamic depictions in the great French caves like Chauvet, dating back 36,000 years before present. Then later, at Lascaux, around 21,000 years BP, their representation is perhaps more stylized but equally dominating.
And it wasn't just Europe.
No. Petroglyphs depicting aurochs in Korda in the Upper Nile Valley date between 19,000 and 15,000 years BP, making them the oldest reliable engravings discovered in Africa to date.
It's the ultimate prehistoric status symbol, and that symbolism seems to have translated seamlessly into the birth of early civilizations in the Near East.
That reverence absolutely carried forward. In Mesopotamia, where early agriculture and empires flourished, the aurochs, known by the Akkadian terms Rimu and Romu, became the quintessential symbol of raw power, untamed masculine sexual potency, and military prowess.
So rulers would boast of hunting them.
Tiglath-Pileser, I did. But more importantly, it wasn't just an animal. It was an epithet used to describe the most powerful deities and legendary figures, including the storm god Enlil, the sun god Shamash, and the mythical hero Gilgamesh, who's often described as having the horns of an aurochs.
And the visual legacy is cemented in one of the most famous structures of the ancient world.
Precisely. The aurochs is depicted in striking relief on Babylon's Ishtar Gate, built during the 6th century BC. This public display, alongside dragons and lions, demonstrates its enduring, powerful association with the might and legitimacy of the ruling city.
Moving into classical antiquity, the Greeks and Romans continued this relationship, but perhaps with a slightly different emphasis. More on the trophy than the god.
The Greeks certainly focused on the conquest. They hunted aurochs not just for meat, but specifically for those monumental horns. These were highly prized as trophies, yes, but also repurposed into massive ceremonial drinking cups known as rhytons.
To drink wine from, symbolizing the conquest of the wild.
Exactly. We see this vividly in the famous Mycenaean Vaphio cup, which beautifully depicts the drama of an aurochs hunt, showing one bull mid-attack throwing a hunter to the ground. That captures the violence and the prestige involved.
And the physical evidence of these trophies is remarkable.
It is. We have historical documentation, like the record that Philip V of Macedon offered a pair of aurochs horns measuring an incredible 105 centimeters or 41 inches in length to a temple dedicated to Hercules. This wasn't just a gift, it was a potent offering of supreme sacrifice and power.
Julius Caesar, ever the meticulous recorder, noted their presence when campaigning in Gaul. What was the Roman perspective on the aurochs?
Caesar wrote about them in his Commentary to Bello Gallico, noting their size and ferocity. For the Romans, the aurochs represented the wild, untamed nature of the territories they sought to conquer. They occasionally captured live aurochs, transporting them back to Rome to be featured in the Venatio shows, the staged animal hunts in amphitheaters like the Colosseum.
Right, to demonstrate Roman dominance over nature.
And over foreign lands. The enormous, aggressive aurochs was a perfect symbol for that purpose.
This high status persisted, even as the species began its decline, shifting into the Middle Ages, especially in the Eastern European territories where they held their final ground.
Their status only intensified. As the species grew rarer, hunting the aurochs ceased to be a general pursuit and became an exclusive, rigid privilege reserved solely for nobles and royals. It was an ultimate expression of aristocratic power.
And we see that echo in medieval literature, too.
Yes, the German heroic epic, the Nibelungenlied, features the hero Sigurd killing 4 aurochs, cementing its role as a monumental mythological opponent. Even in daily life, the memory persisted. Common expressions used in Eastern Europe described a drunken person as behaving like an aurochs, or referred to a physically imposing man as a bloke like an aurochs. The image was deeply embedded in the cultural psyche.
And we can't overlook the enduring artifact status of those horns.
Those horns were preserved and often highly ornamented, becoming treasured drinking vessels. In fact, the horn of the very last aurochs bull to die was documented as being preserved and used as a drinking horn. Politically, the aurochs head, often depicted with a star between its horns, became, and remains today, the official coat of arms of Moldavia. A powerful, centuries-old national symbol derived directly from this magnificent, extinct creature.
Okay, let's pivot now from the trophy and the symbol to the genetic core of the story, domestication. The aurochs is the sole ancestor of all modern cattle, but the truly remarkable insight here is that this was not one unified process. We have evidence of at least 2 major, entirely separate domestication events.
Yes, thousands of miles apart, which is complex for a single species. The complexity is key, and it fundamentally shaped the 2 great global cattle lineages. The first event, about 10,500 years ago during the Neolithic Revolution, gave rise to the taurine cattle, Bos taurus, which encompasses nearly all European, North American, and modern Asian breeds.
And where did that happen?
Genetic analysis indicates that this lineage arose from a surprisingly small founder population, estimated to be only about 80 aurochs tamed in the Fertile Crescent, specifically in southeastern Anatolia and northern Syria.
80 individuals, roughly. How do geneticists arrive at such a precise small number for the founding population? Why is that significant?
That number, derived from mitochondrial DNA analysis, represents the effective population size, the number of breeding females required to explain the observed genetic variation in modern cattle. And the small size, 80 females, it points to a very severe and specific genetic bottleneck at the moment of domestication. It suggests the process started with a tiny, isolated pool of tamed aurochs.
Which explains why modern taurine cattle have relatively low genetic diversity compared to their wild ancestors.
Precisely.
And the second major event.
That gave us the zebu cattle, Bos indicus, easily recognizable by the distinct hump on their shoulders. These arose from the local Indian aurochs, BP pneumaticus, and were domesticated slightly later, spanning the period of 10,000, 8,000 years ago in the Indian subcontinent. Early evidence for this separate domestication is found at Neolithic sites like Mehrgarh in Pakistan. The genetic divergence here is significant, confirming two independent paths from the wild aurochs to the domestic cow.
Once those two lineages were established, the story shifted from taming to mixing. As domestic herds spread and encountered the remaining wild aurochs populations, we see evidence of extensive gene flow, which scientists call introgression. Let's clarify that term.
Introgression is crucial here. While simple hybridization is the initial cross between two species, introgression specifically refers to the long-term flow of genes from one species into the gene pool of another through repeated back-crossing over multiple generations.
And this happened in Europe.
Massively. Between 9,500 and 1,000 BC, wild male aurochs were clearly breeding with the early domestic taurine cows that settlers had introduced from the Near East. This constant influx of wild genes likely helped European domestic cattle adapt to new local pathogens and climates.
And this wasn't limited to Europe. We see African mixing too, right?
Yes. The initial taurine cattle arrived in Africa from the Near East, but before the zebu arrived, they hybridized extensively with the local wild African aurochs. This created adapted taurine African breeds. Then, later, the two domestic lineages, taurine and zebu, met.
When did the taurine and zebu lineages hybridize, and was there a driver for that mixing?
They hybridized significantly in the Near East about 4,000 years ago. And what's critical is that this period coincided precisely with the 4.2 kiloyear drought event, a major global climatic upheaval.
So climate change was the driver.
It seems so. The zebu's spread and its subsequent hybridization with taurine breeds introduced vital traits that were incredibly adaptable to hotter, drier, and more challenging arid environments. Zebu genes brought heat tolerance and likely resistance to certain tropical diseases, making the resulting hybrid cattle much more resilient.
And this historical introgression still has measurable effects in modern herds, correct? It's not just an ancient event.
Absolutely. Gene sequencing studies are constantly finding these continuous genetic connections. For instance, sequencing has shown that modern British and Irish cattle breeds still share specific genetic variants with the Eurasian aurochs. This is direct proof that introgression occurred locally with the wild British aurochs populations before they went extinct there, around 3,000 years ago.
And you can still see it in their appearance.
You can. The persistent exhibition of aurochs-like coat colors, the black bull reddish tie pattern, and the light eel stripe in primitive southern European breeds like Merboden cattle strongly suggest that sporadic localized introgression continued for millennia.
The scale of genetic divergence between the original aurochs groups before domestication tells us something important about their deep evolutionary history. How distinct was the Indian aurochs, for example?
Genetic analysis confirms that the Indian aurochs, BP pneumaticus, was the most genetically distinct of all aurochs populations. Comprehensive sequencing data reveals that this specific population split from the common ancestor shared by the European, Middle Eastern, and East Asian aurochs populations much earlier, around 300,000 to 166,000 years ago.
Wow.
Yeah. This substantial divergence confirms the Indian subcontinent as a highly distinct evolutionary cradle, and it reinforces why the zebu lineage developed entirely separately from the taurine lineage.
As fascinating as its early history is, the story of the aurochs is ultimately a tragedy of extinction. It managed to survive the Ice Age, but it couldn't survive the rising pressure from humanity and our expanding agriculture.
That is the consensus view. While climate change initially dictated glacial retreats, the progressive contraction of the aurochs range during the last 10,000 years was a direct result of two primary human activities: habitat loss and excessive hunting pressure. We often see habitat loss defined broadly, but in Central Europe, the period between the 9th and 12th centuries was environmentally devastating for the aurochs.
How so? What was happening in that specific time frame?
That era saw the massive clear-cutting of large forest tracts across Central Europe, driven by agricultural expansion and the need for timber. This directly destroyed the preferred riparian, woodland, and forest edge habitats that the aurochs relied on. And as their habitat shrank and fragmented, the scattered populations became more vulnerable to hunting.
So even occasional hunting became an unsustainable pressure.
Exactly.
Let's track the extinction across the global groups. When did the Indian and African subspecies disappear?
For the Indian aurochs, the precise timing is murky. They likely succumbed during the Holocene, but distinguishing their late remains from those of early domesticated zebu cattle is difficult. Habitat loss combined with rampant interbreeding with the flourishing zebu herds likely erased the wild population before the historical period.
And the North African aurochs.
That's slightly clearer. The youngest reliable fossil remains date to around 6,000 years before present, though some experts argue based on limited evidence that small pockets might have survived near the Nile Delta well into the Roman era, but this is debated.
The Eurasian aurochs is the one we have the clearest timeline for, right up to the very last individual.
Yes. We can trace its western disappearance. It was extinct in Britain by approximately 3,000 years ago. Populations held on in regions like Hungary until the 13th century. By the close of the Middle Ages, the species was ecologically extinct across most of its former range, surviving only in pockets of Eastern Europe, primarily in Poland and Lithuania, where its hunting was strictly controlled by royal privilege.
And the final act took place in the Jaktaro forest. This is where the story shifts from large-scale natural history to a tragic, intimate historical record.
The Jaktaro Forest, a marshy woodland complex southwest of Warsaw, was the site of the species' final desperate holdout. The Polish crown actively managed this last herd, recognizing its uniqueness. Despite these efforts, the population plummeted rapidly due to habitat destruction and possibly disease spread from domestic cattle. Records show that the herd fell from around 50 individuals in the mid-16th century to just 4 individuals by 1601.
4 animals remaining, and then the final date.
The definitive end came in 1627, when the last remaining Aurochs cow died of natural causes within the confines of the Jaktaro Forest Preserve. It marked the global extinction of the species.
But there was a recent study that complicated this a bit, right?
That's right. A 2021 study complicated this single narrative by dating a horn core found in Sofia, Bulgaria, to the second half of the 17th or even early 18th century. So this suggests that a small population may have survived in northeastern Bulgaria slightly longer than the official Polish record indicates, though the 1627 Polish cow remains the widely recognized symbol of the final extinction.
Regardless of whether it was 1627 or a few decades later in Bulgaria, the aurochs was gone. But its absence didn't end the story. It initiated a movement to bring its physical form back. Tell us about the 20th century attempts at breeding back the aurochs.
This is where we transition into conservation history and genetic engineering. The effort to reverse the extinction, or at least recreate the phenotype, began in the 1920s, driven by the Heck brothers in Germany. Heinz Heck, working at Hellebrunn Zoo, initiated a selective breeding program. His goal was to select and cross specific primitive and rugged domestic cattle breeds, like the Spanish fighting bull, the Corsican cattle, and the large Chianina of Italy, to recreate an animal that looked like the aurochs.
And the result of that initial effort is known as Heck cattle. And these animals gained serious traction, particularly in ambitious rewilding projects later in the century.
This certainly did. Heck cattle were often used as living auroch surrogates to fulfill the ecological role of a large grazer. The most famous example is the Oostvaardersplassen Nature Reserve in the Netherlands, starting in the 1980s. The management philosophy there was a non-interference approach, attempting to mimic natural, prehistorical predator-prey dynamics in a contained area.
That non-interference approach, however, became highly controversial when the weather turned harsh.
It did. The controversy centered on animal welfare during extreme winter conditions. Because the reserve operated under a strict non-interference mandate, supplementary feeding was prohibited. When several cold winters struck, particularly in 2005 and 2010, large numbers of these Heck cattle died of starvation and exposure. Mortality rates sometimes reached 60% in a single season.
Wow. And that sparked a huge public debate.
An intense public and political debate, yes. It was about the ethics of allowing animals to suffer under the guise of natural regulation when the environment itself was not truly natural. It lacked the original large predators that would typically cull the weakest first.
So what was the outcome of that intense public scrutiny?
The ethical arguments eventually led to policy change. The Dutch government intervened, and the non-interference strategy was formally ended in 2018. The policy shifted to active management, including supplementary feeding in winter and culling weaker animals.
So if Heck cattle were only phenotypically similar, are modern projects trying to achieve something closer to a genetic match?
Absolutely. The scientific community recognized that simply breeding for an aurochs-like phenotype is insufficient. You need an aurochs-like genotype. Modern projects like the Taurus Cattle Program, the Tauros Program, and the Urus Project have moved beyond the original HEC breeding pool. They utilize contemporary genomic data, including sequences taken from ancient Aurochs bones, like a 6,750-year-old specimen sequence in England, to identify specific modern primitive breeds that retain the highest percentage of Eurasian Aurochs genetic markers.
So the goal is to create an animal that not only looks like the Aurochs, but also shares those critical genetic traits.
Exactly. To reclaim the original animal's full ecological role and resistance capabilities.
It's a complete narrative arc we've traced today. We started with Bos primigenius, a gigantic, wide-ranging species of the Pleistocene megafauna, revered by archaic hominins, immortalized in the cave art of Lascaux, and functioning as the ultimate symbol of power in the ancient Near East. We then tracked its role in two separate global domestication events that fundamentally underpin modern agriculture, giving rise to every taurine and zebu cow on the planet, leading ultimately to its final official extinction in a managed Polish forest in 1627.
The central takeaway is understanding the scale of this single species impact. The Aurochs' fate demonstrates the intense selection pressure human expansion places on the wild world. Yet, this extinct wild species is the genetic foundation for humanity's most essential domestic resource, our global meat and dairy supply. It highlights a deep, continuous, and often contradictory connection. We eradicated the magnificent wild ancestor only to rely entirely on its tamed descendants. The wild genes remain integrated, proving that even after the original form is gone, its influence is inescapable.
And this leads us to the final provocative thought. If ancient cultures revered the Aurochs as the ultimate symbol of power and used its massive horns as sacred drinking vessels and offerings to the gods, what does it truly say about our modern relationship with nature that we continue these extensive, sophisticated projects using genomic data and selective breeding to artificially breed back its physical form? What level of wildness, what lost environmental function do we truly seek to reclaim in the modern domestic animal? And what does that persistent desire for the original suggest about our regret over engineering its extinction in